The classroom air was thick, heavy with tension. Mrs. Darnell's hands trembled as she slammed the test paper onto the desk, its corners crinkling with the force of her anger. She stood there for a moment, staring down at the boy in front of her. The room fell deathly silent. Every eye in the room fixed on the confrontation, the kind that sent chills through even the bravest students. Before we continue the story, comment what city you're watching us from. Don't forget to subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications if you enjoy stories like this. No one cheats in my classroom, Mrs. Darnell snapped, her voice cutting through the silence like a knife. Especially not in Fairgrove Middle School. You're lucky I don't have you expelled right here, right now. The words hung in the air like a storm cloud, and the boy, Jamal, sat there, his face a mask of confusion and disbelief. His eyes darted between his classmates, some of them shaking their heads, others whispering. A few even looked at him with the kind of pity that made his stomach churn. But there was something more here, something none of them could see. If you've ever felt overlooked or misunderstood, hit that like button and share your experiences. Jalen's story is for anyone who's ever been judged unfairly. Cut to the empty hallways, the echoes of Jamal's footsteps against the linoleum floor. What they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly understand, was that Jamal wasn't the cheater they all thought him to be. In fact, he was far more than they could ever imagine. He was a boy from the poorest corner of West Winslow, a place so far from the shiny halls of Fairgrove, yet destined for a greatness none of them could see coming. Jamal wasn't just some average kid from the wrong side of the tracks. He wasn't a statistic. He wasn't the label they tried to place on him. He was a genius chosen, sent with a purpose so vast it would shake the very foundations of Fairgrove Middle School and change everything they thought they knew about the world. There was something in Jamal that couldn't be ignored, something divine, something hidden beneath the surface. A gift so extraordinary, the world would soon be forced to recognize it. But first, he had to survive this moment. It wasn't just the accusation that was about to change everything. No, it was the revelation that would follow, the truth that would shatter every expectation, every belief, and force a reckoning no one saw coming. The test paper lay on Mrs. Darnell's desk, the marks of a world that failed to understand him. But soon, Jamal's world would be turned upside down, and he would rise. Jamal wasn't just going to prove them wrong. He was going to show them something bigger, something that would leave them in awe. Because this was only the beginning. The world was about to witness what happens when the underestimated fight back, when the truth comes to light, and when a young boy, destined for greatness, finally steps into his calling. In the end, it wasn't the accusation that would define him, it was what came next. Jamal wasn't just a victim of a mistake. He was a messenger. And this message? It would change everything. The classroom that had once looked down on him was about to become the stage for a revelation that would echo far beyond those walls. Jalen Carter wasn't the kind of boy who drew attention to himself. At 12 years old, his presence was often overlooked, as if he were invisible in a school full of faces fighting for space. But Jalen didn't mind being unnoticed. In fact, he preferred it. You see, Jalen was from South Winslow, a tough part of Fairgrove, Georgia, a neighborhood where hope was a rare commodity and dreams felt like luxury items few could afford. Raised by a single mother, Marissa, Jalen knew all too well what it meant to struggle. His mother worked 2 jobs just to keep a roof over their heads, often returning home late at night with nothing but exhaustion etched in her face. Despite the weight of their circumstances, Marissa never let Jalen forget the importance of faith. Every morning, before the sun even rose, she'd lay her hands on his head, whispering prayers over him like a shield of protection. "You're destined for greatness, baby," she'd say, her voice a mix of love and quiet desperation. "God has a plan for you, and no matter how hard it gets, you just keep going. You keep your faith, and you keep believing." Jalen never fully understood the weight of her words, but he trusted them. At school, he was a quiet, reserved boy. His teachers didn't know what to make of him. He wasn't the troublemaker the others expected, but he wasn't exactly a star student either. He blended into the background, trying his best not to stand out. What they didn't know, what no one knew, was that Jalen was brilliant. He had a mind that worked faster than most adults, solving complex math problems in his head as easily as others counted pennies. He read encyclopedias for fun. He could devour books on science, history, and anything else that piqued his interest, but he kept his gifts hidden. Jalen had learned early on that to be labeled smart and his world could be a curse. In a school system that often saw poor black boys as trouble, problematic, or at risk, Jalen was no exception. He'd seen too many of his friends discarded by the system, thrown away like trash, their talents and potential ignored. He wasn't about to let that happen to him. So he stayed quiet, let others take the spotlight. He kept his head down, and for the most part, that worked. But deep inside, Jalen knew he wasn't like the other boys. He wasn't like the ones who gave up and let life define them. He had a secret, a part of himself that, even now, he wasn't ready to share with the world. But in a place like Fairgrove, people didn't see what was underneath. All they saw was what they expected to see, another kid from the wrong side of the tracks. And that's how Jalen became a part of the unspoken narrative of Fairgrove. Another statistic, another face in a long line of forgotten potential. Then there was Mrs. Darnell. She was tough as hard as nails, some said. And that wasn't by accident. Mrs. Darnell had been teaching in the system for years, long enough to become jaded by the constant wave of brokenness she saw in her students. She had no patience for miracles. She had no patience for the kind of stories that spoke of hope, of faith, of the impossible being made possible. Mrs. Darnell didn't believe in the hand of God coming down to save kids like Jalen. Not when the odds were so stacked against them. Not when she'd seen so many kids slip through the cracks and never rise. No, Mrs. Darnell believed in hard work, in following the rules, in playing the game the way it was meant to be played. And Jalen? He was just another face in her class, another kid who would either get by or fade into the background. He didn't stand out to her. Not yet. But there was someone else at the school who did see something in Jalen, something others couldn't or wouldn't. Mr. Elijah. He wasn't like the other staff at Fairgrove. Mr. Elijah was the janitor. Quiet. Old. He moved with a slow, steady grace that seemed at odds with the hustle of the school. He always wore the same faded shirt, and his worn sneakers echoed as he walked through the hallways, his broom sweeping the floor in rhythmic strokes. He wasn't flashy. He didn't try to be noticed. But there was something different about him. Mr. Elijah had a way of looking at people, looking through them, really, that made you feel seen, even if you didn't know him at all. He had a presence, like he carried wisdom far beyond his years, a knowledge of things others couldn't grasp. Jalen didn't know it yet, but Mr. Elijah was someone who had been watching him for a while. Every day after school, when the halls cleared and the teachers went home, Mr. Elijah would sit quietly in the corner of the hallway, cleaning, humming softly to himself, and reciting scripture. There was something about Jalen that caught his eye. Maybe it was the way his eyes always seemed to look a little too far into the distance, like he was searching for something just beyond his reach. Or maybe it was the way Jalen always had a book in his hand, his nose buried in pages while everyone else ran around and played. One afternoon, as Jalen walked by him, Mr. Elijah stopped sweeping. He didn't say anything right away, just stared at Jalen, like he was waiting for something. Finally, he spoke. "You know, boy," he said in his deep, gravelly voice, "there's a lot more to you than meets the eye. Don't let them fool you. God's got a purpose for you. You just have to be patient." Jalen didn't know how to respond. The words felt strange coming from the old man, but something about them stuck in his mind. They gnawed at him, lingered long after he'd gone home, long after he'd closed his bedroom door and sat in the quiet. Mr. Elijah had no reason to say those things to him. He didn't know Jalen's story, didn't know the struggles he'd faced. And yet, there was something in his voice, a knowing, a certainty, that made Jalen wonder. Could it be? Could there really be something more to his life than the world had led him to believe? Jalen wasn't sure. But as the days passed, and the tests piled up, and the pressure mounted, something deep inside him began to stir. The feeling was subtle at first, a quiet whisper in his heart. Maybe Mr. Elijah was right. Maybe, just maybe, there was more to him than what everyone else saw. But it wasn't until Mrs. Darnell's test, and that shocking accusation, that everything would begin to change. Everything would come to light. And Jalen, quiet, brilliant, humble Jalen, would be forced to step into the light. It was a day like any other, or so Jalen thought. The morning sun streamed through the dusty windows of Mrs. Darnell's classroom, casting long shadows across the floor as the bell rang, signaling the start of another routine school day. But today would be different. As the class settled into their seats, Mrs. Darnell stepped to the front of the room, a stack of papers in her hands. "All right, class," she said, her voice firm. "Today's a bit of a surprise. We'll be taking a statewide math assessment. No excuses. I expect your best." Jalen's heart sank. Not because he feared the test. He didn't. He knew the numbers, the formulas, the equations by heart. Math was his language. But in a place where no one expected him to succeed, this test would be his first real opportunity to show what he was capable of. And somehow, he knew, that meant trouble. The test papers were handed out. Jalen opened his, glanced at the first question, and then the next. Within minutes, he was in a rhythm, answering each question quickly, almost effortlessly. He worked through the test with a clarity that others couldn't even begin to fathom. 10 minutes passed. 15. And then, with one final glance over his work, Jalen set his pencil down, the paper now filled with perfect answers. Every problem solved. Every calculation accurate. It was done. Mrs. Darnell walked by Jalen's desk, her eyes narrowing as she noticed the speed at which he had finished. She hadn't even begun to check the other students' progress. And yet, here Jalen was, done. And perfectly so. She picked up his test, and her eyes skimmed through the answers. She froze. Her gaze sharpened as she turned to face him, disbelief written all over her face. "There's no way," Mrs. Darnell said, her voice cold with suspicion. "No way someone like you solved all of these on your own." The accusation came swiftly, harshly. It was as if she couldn't bear to see the truth. Jalen was too quick, too sharp, too good for a boy like him. She couldn't fathom that the answers were his, that a kid from South Winslow, a kid like Jalen, had done this all on his own. Her voice was growing louder now, drawing the attention of the class. The room went silent. Every eye was on him. And suddenly, Jalen felt every ounce of his being pulled into a spotlight he didn't want. His heart raced. His palms grew sweaty. "Jalen, I need you to come with me," Mrs. Darnell said, her voice clipped. The principal was waiting in his office when they arrived. As the doors shut behind him, Jalen felt the weight of the world on his shoulders. The principal, a man who had never paid much attention to Jalen beyond the occasional "keep it down" or "sit still," now looked at him with a different kind of gaze. One of scrutiny. "Mr. Carter, is there something you'd like to explain here?" The principal's voice was a mix of concern and disbelief. Jalen opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat. How could he explain what he'd done? How could he make them understand that he hadn't cheated, that he wasn't some fraud just waiting to be caught? "Sir," Jalen finally said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I didn't cheat." The principal didn't answer right away. He simply stared at Jalen, as if searching for the lie that he was sure lay behind those words. In the hallways, the whispers had already started. By the time Jalen was released from the principal's office, the gossip had spread like wildfire. It didn't matter that Jalen had aced the test. It didn't matter that every answer had come from his own mind. What mattered was that the principal had been called in, that Mrs. Darnell had made the accusation, and that meant something darker, something more insidious, had been planted in the minds of the other students. Jalen Carter, the cheater. The words followed him as he walked through the hallways, each whisper like a slap against his skin. By the time he got home, his shoulders were slumped, and his spirit felt heavy, burdened by the weight of the day. He walked in through the front door, greeted only by the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of a television in the living room. His mom, Marissa, wasn't home yet. She wouldn't be for a few more hours. He sat at the kitchen table, staring at the empty space before him, the quiet gnawing at his insides. 1,000 thoughts ran through his mind. Why did this happen? Why did Mrs. Darnell think I was cheating? I didn't cheat. Why is it always me? Tears began to well up in his eyes, but he didn't let them fall. He wiped them away, trying to hold it all in. Jalen wasn't supposed to cry. He wasn't supposed to feel defeated. But in that moment, that's exactly what he felt. Can you imagine being accused of something you didn't do? Let us know in the comments how you've handled false accusations before, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button. When Marissa came home, the exhaustion from her long day was visible in the way she walked, in the tiredness of her eyes. She'd come home late again, The glow of the kitchen light the only welcome she could offer. But when she saw her son sitting there, head down, shoulders hunched, she knew something was wrong. Without a word, she knelt beside him. She didn't ask him why he was upset or press him with questions. She simply reached for his hand, and without hesitation, she began to pray. "Lord," Marissa whispered, her voice steady and full of grace, "I don't know why this is happening, but I know you do. You've always had a plan for Jalen, and no test, no accusation, no setback can take that away. I trust in you, Lord. I trust that you're holding my son, that you're guiding him. In Jesus' name, amen." Jalen sat there in the silence after the prayer, the tension in his chest beginning to ease, if only a little. His mother didn't panic. She didn't raise her voice or demand answers. She didn't need to. She trusted in something far greater than any test, far greater than any accusation. Some people trust in systems. Some people trust in what they see in front of them. But Marissa? She trusted in Jesus. And for the first time in hours, Jalen felt a sliver of peace. He wasn't alone. His mother's faith, her quiet strength, had reminded him of something important. This moment, this injustice, wasn't the end of his story. It was a test, yes, but one he wasn't meant to face alone. And no matter how dark things seemed, there was a bigger plan unfolding. If you think his mother's faith will work for him, comment "faith over fear" and subscribe. It wasn't supposed to be this way. It couldn't be. But as Jalen walked through the school gates the next morning, he knew, he felt it deep in his bones, that his life had just changed forever. Suspended. Not because he had done anything wrong, but because the world simply refused to believe that someone like him could do something right. The whispers followed him like a dark cloud. His classmates, once indifferent, now mocked him at every turn. Some called him a cheater, others whispered, "He's too smart to be real." Teachers gave him side eyes, not knowing whether to pity him or distrust him. The walls that had once been a silent refuge now felt like a prison. At home, it wasn't much better. His mom, Marissa, was furious. But more than that, she was heartbroken. She had raised him to be better than the world would try to make him. She had prayed over him, taught him to believe in himself, in God's plan. And now, it felt like all of that faith had been crushed under the weight of the system. But through it all, one person never wavered in his belief. Mr. Elijah, the old janitor, was a constant reminder of the strength that could be found in trusting in something greater than yourself. "Don't let them break you, Jalen, Mr. Elijah would say, his voice calm and steady, as though he had lived through this kind of injustice before. "You remind me of David. Everyone doubted him too. But look what happened when he faced Goliath. You're facing your own giant, boy. Keep your faith. You're stronger than they think." Jalen had no choice but to hold on to those words, even when everything else around him was falling apart. He couldn't let the lies define him, couldn't let the accusations tear down what he knew to be true. How did you overcome the impossible? Was there someone like Mr. Elijah in your life to guide you? Let's talk about it in the comments below. So he did something nobody expected. One afternoon, when the school was closed and everyone had gone home, Jalen found himself in the empty classroom where the original test had been taken. He knew he needed proof. He needed something undeniable. He set up his phone to record, took the same math test again, this time with the camera rolling, and solved every problem in exactly the same way as before. His answers were perfect. Again, no shortcuts, no memorization, just his mind, his gifts, and his faith. Jalen knew this wasn't about proving himself to anyone but himself. But the world wasn't going to let him rest. So he did the unthinkable. He sent the video to the principal. He waited and waited, but the response was the same. Mrs. Darnell, still convinced that Jalen had cheated, doubled down. "He must be memorizing the answers somehow," she insisted, her voice shaking with the pride of someone who would rather believe in a lie than accept the truth. There's no other explanation. Jalen's heart broke, not because of the accusation, but because he realized that some people would rather hold on to their pride than admit their mistakes. And that was a battle he couldn't win. But God, in his timing, had a way of turning things around. Jalen was invited to a local church science fair, a small event held every year to encourage the youth in the community. It wasn't much, but it was an opportunity for Jalen to show what he was truly capable of. He spent the next few weeks working tirelessly, using scrap metal from the yard and parts from old machinery. He built a small prototype engine, something that seemed simple to him but would be a marvel to anyone who didn't understand the way things worked. And on the side of the engine, he carved a verse from the Bible, Philippians 4 verse 13. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. When Jalen arrived at the science fair, his project stood out like a shining light in a room full of ordinary displays. He could feel eyes on him as he explained his creation to the judges, who seemed skeptical at first but were quickly won over by the quiet confidence he exuded. One judge, a quiet man from Atlanta Tech Academy, leaned in, intrigued. Who helped you build this? He asked. Jalen stood tall, his hands resting on the edges of the engine. Jesus helped me understand how it works, he said, his voice firm but humble. There was a brief silence, as if the words had hung in the air longer than anyone had expected. And then, to his surprise, the judge smiled. Well, it seems like you're onto something special. Keep building. Keep believing. It wasn't just the judge's words that filled Jalen with hope. It was the recognition, the validation, the proof that there was something in him that no one could take away. He hadn't needed anyone's permission to be great. He just needed to trust God and do the work. But as Jalen stood there, basking in the small victory, something unexpected happened. Mrs. Darnell, who had been walking through the fair as part of her duties, stopped dead in her tracks when she saw the engine. Her eyes widened, and for the first time in weeks, she looked at Jalen with something that wasn't suspicion. She walked over to him, her face pale. That engine, my son tried to build something like that last year, she said, almost to herself. But he didn't succeed. He got caught cheating in the process. Jalen's heart skipped a beat. For the first time, Mrs. Darnell looked vulnerable. The proud, harsh teacher who had once condemned him now stood in front of him, realizing that her own child had done exactly what she had accused Jalen of. She turned to him, her voice shaky. Jalen, I'm sorry. I was wrong about you. And in that moment, Jalen realized something. Forgiveness wasn't about them. It was about him. He could have held on to the anger, the injustice. But instead, he let it go. He knew that if he wanted to be free, he had to let go of the weight of those who couldn't see the truth. If you admire Jalen's ability to forgive Mrs. Darnell, give this video a thumbs up. As the day drew to a close, Jalen walked home with his mom, the weight of the world no longer on his shoulders. The suspicions, the accusations, the doubts, they would no longer define him. God had shown him something deeper, something more powerful than any test or label. If you're still watching, comment, I'm hooked. This story's just getting started. It was an ordinary Tuesday when the phone rang at the Carter household. Jalen was at the kitchen table, doing his homework, when his mom, Marissa, picked up the phone. She listened intently, nodding, a look of surprise crossing her face as she glanced over at Jalen. Dr. Amy Sinclair? From the Georgia Youth Science Initiative? She asked, her voice rising in disbelief. Yes, of course, I can speak with her. Thank you so much for reaching out. Jalen's heart began to race. He had heard about the Georgia Youth Science Initiative, an elite program designed to nurture the brightest young minds in the state, providing mentorship and resources for those who showed exceptional potential. But for someone like him, from a neighborhood like South Winslow, it felt like an impossible dream. Until now. Marissa hung up the phone, turning toward her son, her eyes wide. Jalen, you won't believe this. Dr. Amy Sinclair herself wants to meet you. She heard about your project from the science fair. Jalen froze. The disbelief on his face was clear. He hadn't expected anything like this, especially not after everything he'd been through. It was almost too much to comprehend. But it was real. The moment had arrived. The next day, Dr. Amy Sinclair arrived at Fairgrove Middle School, accompanied by a film crew and several members of the school board. The entire building was buzzing with excitement, teachers and students whispering in awe. Jalen stood in the hallway, feeling the weight of the situation pressing down on him. Mrs. Darnell, who had once doubted him, now watched with an expression that was a mixture of skepticism and curiosity. Jalen, Dr. Sinclair said as she approached him, her voice calm but firm. I've heard a lot about you. Now, I want to see what you can do. Live. In front of the school board. It wasn't a challenge he had expected, but it was one he knew he couldn't back down from. He nodded silently, steeling himself for what was about to come. The school board gathered in the auditorium, cameras rolling as Dr. Sinclair presented the first problem, a complex algorithm that would stump even some of the best mathematicians. Jalen looked at the screen, the numbers dancing in his mind. He closed his eyes for a moment, then began to work through the equations, his hands moving as if they had a mind of their own. The room was silent. The school board watched in stunned amazement as Jalen solved the problem in record time, his focus unshaken. He moved seamlessly from one challenge to the next, his mind clicking into place like gears in a machine. The complexity of the problems didn't faze him. But what truly stunned the room was the way he explained his reasoning. With each problem, Jalen cited biblical principles of logic and wisdom. In Proverbs 2 verse 6, it says, "For the Lord gives wisdom. From his mouth come knowledge and understanding." I believe that every problem has an answer, and it's not just in the numbers. It's in trusting the wisdom that God provides. As Jalen spoke, it was as if the room itself held its breath. The logic was flawless, but it was the faith behind it that captivated everyone. He wasn't just solving math problems. He was demonstrating that his gifts were not of this world alone, but were divinely inspired. Mrs. Darnell, sitting at the back of the room, couldn't believe her eyes. She had always prided herself on being a teacher who could spot a cheater from a mile away. But now, as she watched Jalen solve each problem with ease, she felt something shift within her. Doubt, once so certain, began to crumble. The last problem was the most difficult, a highly abstract equation involving both geometry and algebra. Jalen paused, but only for a moment. He didn't hesitate. He simply allowed the stillness to wash over him. And then, like a man who had solved the world's greatest riddle, he wrote down the solution. When he finished, the room was silent. A full 30 seconds passed before Dr. Sinclair spoke. "Jalen, what you've just done is extraordinary. Your mind is not just sharp, it is a gift. You are a true prodigy. But it's more than that. Your wisdom is deeper than the numbers. It's clear to me, and to everyone in this room, that you have a purpose that goes far beyond academics. We want to offer you a full scholarship to the Georgia Youth Science Initiative." Jalen stood still for a moment, the weight of the moment sinking in. This was the moment when everything changed. The doubt, the mockery, the accusations, they all fell away. He had proven to everyone, including himself, that his gifts weren't just for show, they were part of a bigger plan. But as the applause filled the room, Jalen's mind wasn't on the accolades. He whispered under his breath, just loud enough for only him to hear, "Thank you, Jesus." In the back of the room, Mrs. Darnell sat frozen in her seat. Her mind raced, piecing together the story she had seen unfold before her. She recalled her own childhood, the way she had been just like Jalen. Her father, too, had been a gifted child, one who faced similar accusations, who had been misunderstood and unfairly labeled. But he had overcome it, and so had she. Tears filled Mrs. Darnell's eyes as she remembered the advice her father had given her. When the world doubts you, don't fight back with anger. Fight back with the truth. She had never understood that advice until now. A silence fell over the auditorium as the truth became undeniable. Jalen wasn't just a boy who could do math better than anyone had ever expected. He wasn't just a cheater, a fraud, a statistic. He was a gifted child with a divine purpose. And for Mrs. Darnell, the realization was humbling, almost overwhelming. In that moment, she understood. Jalen wasn't just the future of science or mathematics. He was the future of something far greater. As the crowd cheered, Mrs. Darnell stood, her legs shaky, her heart full. She walked slowly toward Jalen, tears of pride and regret mingling in her eyes. "Jalen," she said quietly, "I was wrong about you. I see now what you're capable of, and I am so sorry." Jalen smiled gently, his voice calm but firm. "It's okay, Mrs. Darnell. I forgive you." And as the applause continued to echo around him, Jalen Carter stood tall, knowing that no matter what the world threw at him next, he had already won the greatest victory of all. The truth had finally come to light. The weeks that followed the science fair were a blur for Jalen Carter. While the buzz of his success still hung in the air, there was a looming question that hung over him like a dark cloud. The school board had reluctantly acknowledged his brilliance, but they remained silent. Despite all the evidence, despite the perfect scores, the undeniable truth that Jalen had never cheated, there was hesitation, a hesitation rooted in politics, appearances, and pride. The educators at Fairgrove Middle School, particularly Mrs. Darnell, couldn't let go of the sting of embarrassment. Her reputation had been called into question, and now, as much as she wanted to admit the truth, she found herself gripped by something deeper, pride. She had built her entire career on her ability to spot dishonesty, to maintain control in her classroom, and now that control had slipped from her fingers. Could she live with the idea of being wrong? Would she forever be known as the teacher who doubted a brilliant child, the one who stood in the way of a miracle? In the quiet of her home, alone in the dark, Mrs. Darnell wrestled with this. She fell asleep, her mind heavy with the weight of her guilt. That night, she had a dream, one that would haunt her for days to come. She was back in church, sitting in the small pew, the echoes of her pastor's voice filling the air. She was 9 years old again, listening to the words that had shaped her youth. When you reject the humble, you reject Christ, the pastor preached, his voice reverberating with conviction. True greatness is found in humility, not in power. Tears welled in Mrs. Darnell's eyes as she heard the words again, sharper than ever. She was back in that little church, and she felt the truth of them deep in her heart. In that moment, she knew what she had to do. She couldn't keep running from the truth. Jalen had shown humility, grace, and strength in the face of mockery and doubt. She had to swallow her pride and do what was right, even if it cost her reputation. She woke up in the early hours of the morning, tears streaming down her face. The dream was vivid, and its message had pierced her soul. She couldn't ignore it any longer. It was time to act, and she knew what that meant. Meanwhile, Jalen's world had shifted from disbelief to quiet determination. The announcement came, a final chance. The school board had decided to give him one more opportunity to prove himself, but it wasn't going to be easy. A local TV station had organized a live math competition, pitting Jalen against the top prep school students from across the state. The stakes were higher than ever: a full scholarship to the prestigious Georgia Youth Innovation Program, a seat at the table with the best and the brightest. As the day of the competition approached, Jalen felt a storm of nerves and pressure building inside him. This was his moment, but it also felt like his greatest test. Would his brilliance hold up under the spotlight? Would the doubts that still haunted the school board be laid to rest, once and for all? On the night before the competition, Marissa and Mr. Elijah sat with Jalen in their small living room. The flickering light of the candle illuminated their faces, casting long shadows on the walls. Marissa reached for her son's hand, her grip tight, her eyes filled with a quiet resolve. "Jalen," she said softly, "this is your moment. But no matter what happens, remember that you are never alone. God is with you, always, and He will give you the strength to rise above this." Mr. Elijah, the kind janitor who had always believed in Jalen, nodded solemnly. He placed a weathered hand on Jalen's shoulder. "The Lord says in Isaiah 41 verse 10, 'So do not fear, for I am with you. Do not be dismayed, for I am your God. I will strengthen you and help you. I will uphold you with my righteous right hand.'" Jalen closed his eyes, feeling the weight of their words sink into his heart. As his mother kissed his forehead, she handed him a small silver cross, one that had been passed down in their family for generations. "Keep this with you," she whispered. "It's a reminder of who you are, who you belong to." Jalen slipped the cross into his pocket, its cool surface comforting him in a way words couldn't. This wasn't just about math. It wasn't just about proving the world wrong. It was about something greater, something divine. He didn't have to face this battle alone. The next day, as the cameras rolled and the countdown to the competition began, Jalen stood backstage, feeling the pressure like never before. The studio was bright, too bright, the air thick with the hum of artificial lights and the rustle of reporters. He could hear the murmur of the crowd as they awaited the contest. Across the stage stood his competitors, well-dressed, well-prepared, poised. They were polished and professional, and they were expected to win. But Jalen knew that this was more than a contest. This was a battle of faith. As the competition began, Jalen's heart raced. The first problem appeared on the screen, complex, detailed, an equation that would have sent even the most prepared students into a panic. His mind froze. The room around him seemed to close in. The pressure was unbearable. For a moment, everything went blank. Then, just as quickly, he remembered. He remembered the words of his mother, the words of Mr. Elijah, the promise in Isaiah 41 verse 10. He took a deep breath. And in that moment, he let go. Jalen exhaled, closed his eyes for a brief second, and felt the calmness of God wash over him. The answer wasn't in the numbers. It was in the faith. He picked up his pencil, and like a waterfall, the answers came pouring out of him. One by one, each problem unfolded, each answer clear and effortless. It wasn't him. It wasn't just his brilliance. It was something far greater than him. It was divine clarity. The audience watched in stunned silence as Jalen worked through each equation with ease. And when the final problem was solved, the room erupted into applause. Jalen smiled, but it wasn't a smile of triumph. It was a smile of peace. He had done what he had set out to do, not just for himself, but for a purpose that was greater than all of this. And as the cameras flashed and the reporters swarmed, Jalen knew one thing for certain. The true victory wasn't in the scholarship, the recognition, or the accolades. It was in knowing that he had humbled the proud, and that the truth had finally come to light. As Mrs. Darnell watched from the back of the room, she wiped away a tear. She had seen the transformation, not just in Jalen, but in herself. She had learned the hardest lesson of all. Pride would always be the enemy of truth. And in that moment, she knew that the humble would always rise higher than the proud. The fall had been steep, but the redemption had been greater than anyone could have imagined. Do you think Jalen will pass the math competition? Hit the subscribe button if you think so. The final seconds of the math competition ticked away, but for Jalen Carter, time had long since ceased to matter. He had done what no one thought was possible. As the last equation solved itself before him, his pencil still in hand, the world seemed to hold its breath. The crowd, once silent, erupted into applause, a thunderous wave of sound that rattled the studio walls. Jalen had won, against the odds, against the doubters, against every force that had tried to break him. The excitement was palpable, yet through it all, Jalen stood calm, almost detached from the celebration. The cheers and flashing cameras felt distant, like an echo in a room he'd long since left. His mind, his heart, was somewhere deeper, somewhere that had always been there, guiding him, strengthening him through every trial. Jalen's faith helped him rise above everything that tried to break him. If his faith journey inspired you, hit the subscribe button for more real-life stories of redemption. But it was the moment that followed that would define him. As the applause roared, Mrs. Darnell walked across the stage. Her face was pale, her expression unreadable as she approached Jalen. The room hushed. The once imposing teacher, the one who had doubted him at every turn, was now standing face to face with the very student she had condemned. She extended her hand. Her voice, low and heavy with regret, cut through the tension in the room. "I was wrong," she said, her words raw. "And I'm sorry." For a moment, the weight of those words hung in the air like a heavy fog, thick with the emotion of years of pride, shame, and reconciliation. The crowd waited, unsure of how Jalen would respond. The bitter sting of all that had come before was still fresh in the minds of many. Would he lash out? Would he refuse to accept her apology? But Jalen, standing there as if he had always known this moment would come, simply reached out. He pulled Mrs. Darnell into a hug, the very last person anyone would have ever imagined him forgiving. His voice, soft but resolute, whispered in her ear, "I forgive you." The crowd gasped, some stunned by the maturity, others by the grace that Jalen exuded. It was a moment that went beyond the competition, beyond the math problems, and even beyond the victory. It was about healing, about rising above the bitterness of the past and showing a deeper kind of strength. If you've ever been in a position where you had to stand tall against all odds, hit the subscribe and leave a comment. Your experiences could help someone who's facing the same struggle. Later, as reporters swarmed to interview the new champion, Jalen spoke not of his triumph, not of the prize money or the scholarship that awaited him. His words were simple, but they carried the weight of his journey. "My gift is not for me," Jalen said, his voice steady and sincere. "It's to remind people that God chooses the unlikely." He chooses the ones that the world overlooks, the ones who others say aren't good enough or smart enough. But with him, we're more than enough. Those words, simple yet profound, became the cornerstone of his legacy. It wasn't just about math or being right. It was about the message he carried. The world would now see him as more than just a kid from the wrong side of town. He was a messenger, a living testament to the power of faith, and a living example of how God had a plan for even the most overlooked, the most underestimated. And then, just as suddenly as he had appeared in Jalen's life, Mr. Elijah, his quiet, wise mentor, was gone. It happened almost overnight. One morning, Jalen came to school to find that Mr. Elijah hadn't shown up to sweep the floors. No one knew where he had gone. No one had seen him leave. Some whispered that he had moved on. Others speculated that he had simply retired. But there was a lingering feeling, a sense that something greater was at work. Some even began to wonder aloud if Mr. Elijah had been more than just a janitor, if he had been an angel, sent to guide Jalen in his time of need. No one could explain his mysterious disappearance, but one thing was clear. Mr. Elijah had played a crucial role in Jalen's journey, a quiet force in the background, always pointing him toward the truth. And now, it seemed, his work was done. With the victory came new opportunities, but Jalen's heart remained rooted in his community. Despite the praise and accolades that poured in, Jalen didn't forget where he came from. He returned to South Winslow, to the place that had shaped him, to the place that had tested his resilience. There, he began tutoring younger kids, helping them unlock the same potential he had discovered within himself. It wasn't just about teaching them math. It was about teaching them to believe in themselves, to see beyond the labels others placed on them. Jalen didn't stop there. He took his newfound platform and created a faith-based STEM club, where students from all walks of life could come together and explore the wonders of science, technology, engineering, and math through the lens of faith. It wasn't just about equations and formulas. It was about building a community of young minds who believed that their brilliance could change the world. And so, Jalen Carter's story continued, not as a flash in the pan, not as a one-time wonder, but as a beacon of hope, a living reminder that God's plans are often bigger than we can understand, and that the most unlikely of heroes can change everything. As the years passed, Jalen's name became synonymous with inspiration. He wasn't just the kid who had solved impossible math problems. He was the young man who had shown an entire school that faith, humility, and genius could come from the most unexpected places. And in the process, he had reminded everyone who had ever doubted him, or anyone like him, that the impossible was never really impossible. Jalen had proven that when you place your trust in God, and when you stay true to who you are, there is no obstacle too great. There is no challenge too insurmountable. There is no dream too big. And through it all, Jalen Carter remained steadfast, humble, and grounded in his faith, always ready to remind others that the greatest gift was not the victory, but the grace with which it was won. Jalen showed us that the impossible can be made possible with grace and perseverance. If this story inspired you, share it with a friend who needs a little hope today. As Jalen Carter's story comes to a close, the echoes of his journey still reverberate through the hearts of everyone who's heard it. But now, it's time for you, the one watching, the one listening, to take a moment and reflect. Have you ever been underestimated? Have you ever been accused of something you didn't do? Forced to carry the weight of a lie that wasn't yours to bear? Maybe it was in the classroom, or at work, or even in your own family. Maybe you were labeled, overlooked, judged for who you were or where you came from. If so, how did you handle it? What kept you going when the world seemed to be against you? Share your story in the comments below. Your voice, your experiences, they matter. Just like Jalen, maybe your greatest strength came from your faith or the people who supported you. Maybe, like him, you found a way to rise above the darkness and prove the world wrong. If Jalen's journey has inspired you in any way, give this video a like so others can hear this message, so others can know that even in the hardest moments, there's hope. Like this video if you believe in the power of redemption and the strength of standing up for what's right, even when no one else believes in you. And don't forget to subscribe. We've got more real-life stories like Jalen's, stories rooted in faith, justice, and redemption. Stories that remind us all that we are more than our circumstances, more than the labels others place on us, and more than the mistakes we've made. There's always room for grace, always room for redemption. This is just the beginning. So, subscribe, Turn on notifications and let's continue to tell the stories that matter. The stories that remind us that we are never alone, that faith moves mountains, and that the most unlikely among us can change the world. Because the journey of faith, justice, and redemption, it's only just begun.